In 2019, scientists released 5,000 bison into a dying Texas wasteland. Within 24 months, NASA satellites flagged the data coming off that land as a processing error. The computers looked at what was happening on the ground and concluded the numbers were impossible. Researchers had to manually check the equipment. The instruments were fine. The land just wasn't following the rules anymore. This is the story of what happened next, and why the scientists who designed the project say they were not prepared for what they witnessed. But before you understand what came back, you need to understand what was lost. Because the destruction of this land did not happen overnight. It happened slowly, the way the worst things always do. Quietly, year by year, while everyone assumed someone else was paying attention. 150 years ago, the land that covers the Great Plains of North America was one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. Deep, dark soil, grasses with roots reaching 12, 15 feet underground. A water table so stable it fed springs and rivers through droughts that would have collapsed anything less resilient. And moving across all of it in herds so large that early settlers described the horizon as black and moving, 60 million bison. The decimation of bison herds and prairie wildlife, coupled with the rapid settlement and spread of farming, completely changed the landscape from prairie grasslands to wheat fields. The massive root systems of native prairie grass were replaced by shallow-rooted crops. When an unprecedented drought hit in the 1930s, the topsoil dried out. Winds whipped across the plains, picking up the dry dust which had once been fertile earth, forming the enormous storms that defined the Dust Bowl. Millions of people were displaced. An ecosystem that had been stable for millions of years collapsed in less than a generation, and the damage did not stop when the drought ended. It just continued more quietly. The bison were gone. The grasses were gone. What replaced them, cattle and crops, did not maintain the land. They extracted from it. By the mid-1920s, more than 80% of all native vegetation in Texas had already been lost to farming. Since 2010, over 57 million acres of American prairies have been converted to cropland. Today, only 4% of native prairies remain. NASA satellite data measuring atmospheric dust across the Great Plains shows that wind-blown dust levels have doubled over the past 20 years. Researchers have confirmed the trend going back more than 2 decades. The dust storms are not just an environmental concern. They contain ultrafine particles that penetrate the lungs and cause heart and lung disease in surrounding communities. The land is not recovering on its own. It is continuing to decline. And the reason it is declining is not complicated. It lost the animal that built it. Here is the part that sounds like it should be common knowledge but isn't. A bison and a cow look similar enough that most people treat them as interchangeable. Big animals, grass, open land. But in terms of what they actually do to the ground they walk on, they might as well be from different planets. Cattle are selective grazers. They hunt for the most nutritious plants, eat them to the root, and ignore the weeds and invasive species pushing in from the edges. Over years and decades, that selectivity creates a vacuum that native grasses cannot fill. The invasives can, so the natives retreat, and the land degrades one season at a time. Cattle also barely move. Left to their own patterns, they return to the same water sources, graze the same patches repeatedly, and avoid rough terrain entirely. This creates 2 problems at once: overused land that gets stripped bare and an untouched land that fills with woody shrubs. Neither functions the way healthy prairie should, and no patch of ground ever gets the recovery time it needs. In the stretch of Texas where the scientists were working, the invader was mesquite. It moved in slowly, the way permanent damage always does. By 2010, the land had been officially reclassified as semi-arid scrubland, which is a scientific way of saying the prairie was dead. The grass was gone. The topsoil that had once made this some of the richest grazing territory in North America was blowing away in the wind. What remained was hard-packed earth, dry as brick. Wells that ranchers had relied on for generations were dropping year after year. Seasonal creeks stopped flowing entirely. Without thick root networks to absorb rainfall, water hit the surface and bounced off, running into gullies or evaporating before it could go down. The water table was collapsing. The cycle locked in. Less grass meant harder soil. Harder soil meant less water absorption. Less water meant less grass. Each year the spiral tightened. Each year the land moved further from anything resembling recovery. Millions of dollars had been spent trying to reverse it. Mechanical clearing, herbicide programs, expensive irrigation, mesquite trees pulled out by the root, new grass seeded by the ton. Some of the replanted grass took hold for a season or 2. Then the mesquite came back. The bare patches returned. The soil kept hardening. None of it held, because none of it addressed the actual problem. The interventions were treating symptoms on a landscape that had lost its operating system. By the time the scientists arrived with their plan, most people had written the land off entirely. The plan was simple. Deceptively, almost embarrassingly simple. Bring back the animal that was supposed to be there, not cautiously. Not a small pilot program on a demonstration plot. 5,000 plains bison, released onto 150,000 acres of broken scrubland. No slow introduction, no safety net, just the animals and the land and the willingness to see what happened. Local ranchers were alarmed. Even some scientists pushed back. The land was barely supporting a handful of cattle. How was it supposed to absorb thousands of bison? The consensus expectation, even among supporters of the project, was that meaningful change would take 20, maybe 30 years to show up in the data. Some genuinely feared the bison would strip what little remained and leave behind something worse than what they started with. Scientific research into bison reintroduction had shown that, compared to ungrazed areas, reintroducing bison could increase native plant species richness by over 100% at local scales, but gains typically developed over decades. No one had attempted a release at this scale in a landscape this degraded. The funding nearly collapsed twice. Advisory boards argued that a failure at this scale would set back restoration science by a decade. The scientists went ahead anyway. From the very first day, the bison moved nothing like cattle. They didn't wander and pick. They swept across the land in what looked to observers at the fence line like pure destruction. They bit plants to the soil. They stomped across everything in their path. They knocked into mesquite trees with their bodies, rocking the roots until the trees gave way. To the untrained eye, it looked like chaos. To the land, it was exactly what it had been waiting 100 years for. Native prairie grasses did not evolve in a world without bison. They evolved with them. Over millions of years, these grasses developed deep, resilient root systems, specifically designed to survive being eaten nearly to the ground and stamped on by animals weighing a ton. Being grazed hard does not kill them. It stimulates them. It tells the plant to push its roots deeper, to store more carbon underground, to spread wider. The growth point of a prairie grass sits below the soil surface, not above it. You can remove every visible blade, and the plant doesn't just survive. It comes back faster and stronger than before because the grazing triggers a hormonal response that accelerates root expansion. This is a relationship so old, it is written into the genetics of the plant itself. Remove the bison, and the grass still carries those instructions. It just has no reason to use them. Mesquite, by contrast, had not co-evolved with anything like this. Its roots were shallow, its seedlings were fragile. The constant pressure from 5,000 animals moving across the land was something it had no defense against. Within the first year, mesquite coverage in the most active zones dropped by 30%, a level of land clearing that would have cost millions of dollars using human machinery. The bison accomplished it by simply living. Every bison produces roughly 50 pounds of waste per day. Multiply that by 5,000 animals, and you get 250,000 pounds of natural fertilizer distributed across the landscape every single day, not concentrated in lagoons or hauled away in trucks, spread across hundreds of thousands of acres in a pattern no human operation could replicate. That waste feeds the insects that aerate the soil, the fungi that decompose it, and the bacteria that transform it into something plants can absorb. It is a cascading gift that multiplies at every level of the food web. Then there is something the bison were doing beneath the surface that no one had fully anticipated. When a herd of thousands moves across the earth, it vibrates. Some researchers believe the specific frequency created by that many heavy animals running together travels deep into the soil and acts as a biological activation signal. Dormant fungi, sleeping bacteria, microbial networks that had been in a kind of suspended state through decades of degradation, holding still, waiting for conditions to change. The soil microbiome, the world of trillions of organisms living in a single handful of healthy dirt, responsible for everything from nitrogen fixation to water retention to disease suppression in plants, had been collapsed. And it turns out that microbiome may respond to signals that only large animals can send. If the theory holds, bison aren't just grazers, they are living tuning forks, restarting underground ecosystems from the inside out. And then there were the wallows. When a 2,000-pound animal rolls on the ground to cool off or scrape away insects, it carves a depression into the earth, typically around 10 feet wide and 2 feet deep. With 5,000 bison on 150,000 acres, the land ended up covered in thousands of these bowl-shaped holes. Individually, each wallow looks like a small disturbance. Collectively, they function as a landscape-scale water harvesting system that no engineer designed and no budget approved. When rain came, the wallows caught it. Instead of sheeting off the hard surface and disappearing into gullies, water collected in these natural basins and held. Some wallows retained standing water for days, even weeks. They became miniature wetlands scattered across the landscape, each one a tiny reservoir that attracted insects, amphibians, and small mammals. The ground around them stayed saturated long enough for something remarkable to happen. The American West is full of what ecologists call ghost seeds, native grass and wildflower seeds that have been buried in the soil for decades or longer, preserved in the cold dark, waiting not just for rain, but for the right conditions. The wallows provided moisture and light. And according to emerging research in botanical science, they may have provided something else, the chemical signature of bison: dung, urine, musk. Certain plants appear to have evolved specifically to detect that signature as a germination signal. Without bison, those seeds may simply never wake up, no matter how much water falls. The concept has a name, associative germination. The idea is that some plant species have germination triggers tied not just to temperature and moisture, but to the presence of specific animals in their environment. Don't wake up until the conditions that made the prairie work are actually back. Those buried seeds were not just waiting for rain, they were waiting for proof. Within 6 months, plant species that hadn't been seen in this part of Texas since the 1950s began appearing in and around the wallows. Rare grasses, native wildflowers, species that weren't in any modern survey of the area. Soil compaction dropped by 40% in the first year. Bison hooves were breaking the surface crust, pushing air deep into the earth. What had been brick was becoming soil again. By 18 months, vegetation coverage had jumped from 30% to 65%. Native grasses were spreading in waves across the landscape. The data coming off NASA's satellites was initially flagged as anomalous. The computers didn't believe it. Nature wasn't supposed to move this fast. The researchers demanded the instruments be rechecked. The instruments were fine. The land was just not following the models. The land was following the bison. As the grass returned and water started holding in the soil, the rest of the animal kingdom began responding. Before the reintroduction, the land had been nearly silent. A coyote moving alone, a hawk circling over lizards, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful. It's the quiet of a system that has been emptied out. Not enough life to sustain predators, not enough food to build populations. Then 5,000 bison walked in and everything changed. The coyote population tripled within the first year. Not lone, desperate animals, healthy packs, denning near the herd, raising young in the shadow of abundance. Golden eagle sightings increased by 400%. Black vultures appeared in numbers that had never been documented in the region. Every predator within range heard the signal and responded. And the return of those predators changed the behavior of every animal below them. When coyotes and eagles are present, rabbits and prairie dogs can't afford to stay in one place. They move constantly. That constant movement means no single patch of ground gets grazed to the soil. The grass has time to recover between visits. It grows taller. Root systems develop depth. This is what ecologists call a trophic cascade, the top of the food chain shaping the health of the land all the way down to the dirt. By the end of the second year, mountain lions had been spotted on the property. Mountain lions don't wander into a landscape by accident. They require enormous territory, reliable prey, and ecological complexity. Their presence was the clearest possible signal that something profound had occurred. A year earlier, this was dead scrubland. Now mountain lions were moving through its shadows. The insect story told the same story. Species counts jumped from 47 to over 300 in 3 years. Native bees returned to wildflowers blooming in the wallows. Dung beetles, a critical component of nutrient cycling that had been virtually absent from the degraded land, reappeared in force, drawn by the enormous volume of bison waste now distributed across the landscape. Those beetles buried dung underground, aerating the soil and accelerating nutrient cycling in ways that compounded every other recovery signal the researchers were measuring. And then came the water. Streams that had been dry for decades began to flow, not a trickle. Actual moving water carving channels through ground that had been cracked and silent for longer than most of the researchers had been alive. The soil, now loose, now deep, now alive with root networks and fungal threads, was acting like a sponge. Rain that had been bouncing off hardpan and running to nowhere was now being absorbed, stored, and slowly released back into the system. The water table was rising. Ranchers on adjacent properties reported their wells stabilizing for the first time in years. The land that had been described as drought-stricken was now managing its own water supply. 5,000 animals had done what no government program had managed to accomplish. Then the carbon numbers came back, and the researchers initially assumed the equipment was broken. A functioning grassland stores most of its carbon underground, in root systems that reach 10, 12, 15 feet down. When fire sweeps through a prairie, which it does regularly and naturally, the roots are untouched. The carbon stays locked in the earth. When a forest burns, the carbon stored in every trunk goes back into the atmosphere within days. A prairie holds carbon in its soil, which is stable. Soil carbon doesn't burn. It doesn't blow away. It can persist for thousands of years if the ecosystem above it stays intact. Before the bison arrived, this Texas land was doing the opposite of storing carbon. It was leaking it. Dying soil, eroding land, dead vegetation. Together, they turn a landscape from a carbon sink into a carbon source. The wound was exhaling. Then the bison came and the chemistry flipped. Within 2 years, soil samples taken across the 150,000 acres showed a 40% increase in stored carbon. The lead researchers assumed the instruments were miscalibrated. They sent the samples back multiple times. They demanded the equipment be retested. The numbers were simply too large to believe. But the machines weren't broken. The land was genuinely pulling carbon out of the atmosphere at a rate that surprised everyone in the field. Research into bison-driven carbon sequestration, published in 2024, found that even a relatively small herd of 170 European bison, roaming about 30 square miles of grassland, could potentially capture the yearly carbon equivalent of removing tens of thousands of cars from the road. The mechanism, bison grazing triggering deeper root growth, which locks plant-derived carbon into stable soil organic matter, has been confirmed across multiple study sites and is now considered one of the most cost-effective carbon capture processes available anywhere. No subsidies, no machinery, no carbon capture technology requiring ongoing maintenance and investment. Just animals doing what they have done for millions of years: grazing, moving, living. The mechanism is elegant. When bison graze the top of a grass plant, the plant diverts energy downward, pushing its root mass deeper into the soil. Those roots are made almost entirely of carbon the plant has pulled from the air through photosynthesis. When the roots eventually die and decompose, and that carbon is incorporated into the soil, locked underground, stable, and out of the atmosphere. The bison, by grazing, are essentially triggering a biological carbon pump. Every bite they take drives carbon deeper into the earth. Now hold those results and sit with the scale question, because this is where the story stops being about one project in Texas. The Great Plains of North America cover an enormous area, and most of that land is in serious trouble. Since 2010, over 57 million acres of American prairies have been converted to cropland. Only 4% of native prairie now remains. Atmospheric dust across the Great Plains has doubled over the last 20 years. Scientists studying the trend have warned explicitly that if cropland expansion continues at this rate and drought risk increases due to climate change, the conditions for a second Dust Bowl are already forming. The first Dust Bowl displaced millions of people and reshaped American history. The conditions building now are by some measures worse. The tools we have thrown at this problem, erosion controls, drought-resistant crops, irrigation subsidies, are all downstream interventions. They treat symptoms. None of them address what the land actually lost. Scientific studies tracking bison reintroduction over nearly 30 years have documented increases in native plant species richness of more than 100% at local scales. Gains were resilient to the most extreme drought in 4 decades. These gains are now among the largest recorded increases in species richness due to grazing in grasslands anywhere on Earth. Grazing by domestic cattle produced gains too, but at less than half the rate of bison. The difference is not subtle. It is not a question of management technique or grazing schedule. The biology is simply different. Cattle don't wallow. They don't generate the same hoof impact patterns. They don't carry the chemical signals in their waste that appear to wake dormant seeds. They don't vibrate the soil the way a moving herd of thousands does. They didn't co-evolve with these grasslands. Bison did. And the land knows the difference at a cellular level. The U.S. Department of the Interior has noted that while bison have been brought back from the edge of extinction, from fewer than 500 animals in the late 1800s to more than 15,000 today, they remain functionally extinct to grassland systems. The land needs them back not in conservation herds, but in ecologically functional numbers, behaving the way wild herds behave. In 2024 alone, 543 bison were transferred from nature conservancy preserves to tribal nations across 10 states. Since 2020, more than 2,300 bison have been returned to indigenous managed land as part of a growing movement that combines ecological restoration with cultural healing. The momentum is building. But the scale of what is needed and the scale of what is happening are still vastly different. Here is what the modeling says. If bison were returned to even 10% of the Great Plains, just 50 million acres, the projected impact would be continental. Fixed water cycles, billions of tons of carbon pulled underground, thousands of species pulled back from collapse. Aquifers that are currently being drained faster than they can refill beginning to stabilize. The conditions for a second Dust Bowl beginning to reverse. The solution was never lost. It was just reassigned. This is also where the story runs into its hardest part. The Great Plains are not empty. They are occupied by ranching families, by cattle operations, by an agricultural economy built over generations that feeds hundreds of millions of people. The ranchers who work this land aren't the villains of this story. They followed the system they were handed, a system that was sold to them as the rational way to manage the land. But the system is failing. The soil knows it. The aquifers know it. The dust sensors that NASA has been running for 20 years know it. Some researchers are exploring middle paths, adaptive grazing systems where cattle are moved frequently across smaller plots in a way that mimics the movement patterns of wild herds. Early results show real improvements in soil health, grass density, and water retention compared to conventional continuous grazing. But even the most optimistic practitioners acknowledge that managed cattle cannot fully replicate what bison do instinctively. The behavior, the biology, and the evolutionary relationship with the land are not the same. Bison aren't just a different animal. They are the original operating system of this ecosystem. And ecosystems, it turns out, remember their original software. What happened in Texas was not a miracle in the supernatural sense. It was a miracle in the mechanical sense. The right parts returned to the right machine in the right quantity. The land didn't need engineering. It didn't need a plan more sophisticated than the one it had been running on its own for millions of years. It needed the thing it had always been missing since the slaughter of the 1800s. The animal that co-evolved with the grass, that broke the soil, that fertilized it, that carved water basins with its body, that carried chemical signals in its waste, that vibrated the earth under its hooves in a frequency that woke up the biology sleeping underground. Give the land that one thing, and it did the rest. There is a lesson here that goes beyond wildlife management or carbon policy. It is a lesson about what we think we understand versus what nature actually knows. The scientists who designed this project were deeply informed, careful people. They had decades of ecological research behind them, and the speed and completeness of what they witnessed forced even the most experienced among them to revise their assumptions about how fast a broken system can heal when given what it genuinely needs. We tend to imagine restoration as slow, painstaking work, scientists with clipboards monitoring incremental change, decades of waiting, uncertain outcomes. What this project demonstrated is that, under the right conditions, nature doesn't recover slowly. It recovers like it has been waiting for permission. All anyone had to do was give it back the thing it asked for. The land that was brick is now soil. The creeks that were silent are now running. The water table that was collapsing is rising. The species that hadn't been seen in decades are back, and the satellites that flagged the data as a processing error are still running, still measuring a landscape that continues to outperform every model built to predict it. We are standing at a real crossroads. One direction leads toward continued degradation, thinner soil, rising dust, aquifers drained dry, a landscape that dries up season by season until it repeats what the 1930s began. The other direction looks like it always did, brown and enormous and slow-moving, raising dust from a land that finally remembers how to make it. Not dust that blows away, dust from a herd, the kind the plains were built to hold. The bison showed us what the land is still capable of. The only question left is whether we are willing to get out of the way